Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's solo flight special is being captained by Randy Wright. We know you have a choice in your radio listening pleasure, and we would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, so please fasten your seatbelts and ensure that all seatbacks and tray tables are stowed in the upright and locked positions. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we cruise above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style. Once again, we thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is Randy Wright, your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we are confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelt, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, if you haven't heard, things have only gone from bad to worse for embattled television sitcom and pop culture super idol Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby's claim to fame started back in the mid to late 1980s when he participated in the development of a revolutionary new television sitcom series that focused on the day-to-day antics of an average American middle-class black family. Indeed, Cosby had stated one of the main impetuses behind his wanting to go forward with that show and develop it was his desire to shatter the stereotypical view that most Americans held with respect to your average or ordinary middle-class black family. And in that respect, he proved to be quite successful. The show proved to be wildly popular with black and white audiences alike and cut through a large cross-section of the American culture and basically defined an era for a generation of television viewers. As for me, there was an interesting connection to the show because I grew up in a medical family and Cosby's character, Dr. Clifford Huxtable, was a physician, and so that seemed to reach out to me. You know, I'm kind of the black sheep of my family because I come from a family of two physicians, and then my sister is also a physician, so I'm a bit of the black sheep, having gone into law. Nevertheless, it was this fatherly figure image that Cosby had put out that had placed him in a respectable position throughout society, and due to the show's just rapid-fire success, he was able to amass great amounts of wealth, allowing him to purchase a large mansion in a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and even long after the show went off the air, he continued to engage in philanthropic activities at Temple University, which is also located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So for years, Cosby had been seen as this role model, especially for the black community in the United States, and he actually did draw the ire of the radical extremist fringes of the left because he said blacks should go out and desire to have an education, should desire to improve themselves, and should try to fit into society as it is now. Of course, if you look at the message of what the radical extreme fringes of the left want society to be, you will see it'll be like what Obama said about a year ago when he claimed that racism is inherently part of the DNA of America, and therefore the country can never really right that wrong. And I just think that that's a foolish position to take because it really does limit the country, and it limits the possibilities of a segment of our population. You know, as Jeremy and I have oft-times reiterated on past episodes of The Wright Flyer, the United States of America is a nation of laws, not of men. So what exactly does that old adage mean? Well, it means that the laws are to apply equally to all Americans, irrespective of skin color or gender, or whether we were natural born or naturalized. And that was one of the beautiful things about our system of government. And it is one of the beautiful things about our entire identity as a people and a nation. And it's tragic to see that the radical and extreme fringes of the left would attack that. And so it's also tragic that when we look at someone like Bill Cosby to see just how far he has fallen, because his reputation has been tarnished and has suffered a truly horrific setback when all of a sudden there was this plethora of allegations by women that he had drugged them and then sexually abused them while they were rendered incapacitated, unable to fight back or to resist these unwanted sexual advances. Up until this point, this has all been through private or civil suits that were brought against him, and he settled a lot of them. And in fact, the most recent event or development with all of this, up until these criminal allegations and charges have been brought by the Montgomery County, Pennsylvania District Attorney's Office, was that he was going to file a defamation of character lawsuit against the alleged victims. And I say alleged because we have to go by the court system and the legal system here with respect to that. And so until he is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, it's just speculation until it's actually proven. And I'm not saying that to take away from any of the claims. And, where there's smoke, there's usually fire, and it's a problem. Not to mention that he has actually admitted to giving women that he wished to have intercourse with quaaludes in the past, and that's a kind of sedative that's now basically illegal to have, and it's not a good thing for him, especially for the father figure image that he had built for generations of television audience members. And it really is very tragic to see this develop as it has, but if he is guilty, then I say let the court system go through the legal process as it's meant to. As a criminal defense attorney, I believe in the criminal justice system. I believe that it needs to go through the process that it does because each and every one of us is entitled to that presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Unfortunately, what we've seen with a lot of these high-profile type cases in the past is that they get tried in the court of public opinion that really doesn't have any of the evidentiary standards that we have with respect to the criminal justice system. And I think that that does a great disservice to the accused because one of their most important fundamental and unalienable rights is the ability to have a speedy trial that is objective in front of a jury of their peers that haven't been tainted. Well, when you've got this 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle that we've had ever since really the development of cable news, it's just been a non-stop parade. And the sad thing is, it's kind of like a circus court. It is a kangaroo court that really no one can get a fair and decent trial because you have these unscrupulous reporters running out and just throwing stories out and then putting their twist on it. For instance, the New York Daily News put out this article today at about 2:20 a.m., once again pointing to this whole 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle in a piece that was written by Nancy Dillon, Ryan Sitt, and Stephen Rex Brown for the New York Daily News. They included a little bit of editorialization in the article. It starts off that, here's where the laughter ends. Okay, that's cute. Bill Cosby, America's dad, accused of rape by dozens of women, was finally hit with a criminal charge Wednesday before getting released on $1 million bail. Just weeks before the statute of limitations was set to expire, prosecutors charged Cosby with sexually assaulting a Temple University employee at his suburban Philadelphia mansion way back in 2004. And it says that he was basically a creep in one part of the article, and bear with me, I am trying to find that within the article. And here it is. The evidence is strong, said Montgomery County Prosecutor Kevin Steele, announcing a single count of aggravated indecent assault against the creepy comedian. Right there. That type of editorialization that's in a nationally syndicated newspaper or magazine or any type of website publication is damning. And the reason I say it's damning is because it really does make it that much more difficult for the accused to get a fair trial. And, maybe it sounds like I'm whining about this, but I'm not really. Because as an officer of the court, I find that it's very important that people have their rights. As a defense attorney, it's my job to make sure that all of my clients are afforded the same type of representation and same access to the court that I would expect for myself if ever I found myself accused of doing some sort of criminal wrongdoing. And pray to God that that never happens, but you never know with the way that this regime is going and the assault that we have on free speech. But speaking to this case in particular, there's been a lot of things that are just strange about it. Like, for instance, this idea that it is being brought mere weeks before the statute of limitations was due to toll on this. That's kind of creepy lawyering 101. And there's a definite amount of nasty backroom politics that has been going on with this case. And once again, as a criminal defense attorney, I have seen firsthand the type of wicked politics that occurs during an election cycle, particularly, but with the district attorney's office. And it's not a pretty picture. And in many instances, they are playing a deadly game with the lives and the rights of the accused. And that's the thing, folks. You've always heard Jeremy and I say on past episodes of The Wright Flyer that one of the most important things and the greatest birthrights that we have as American citizens is the Constitution, which safeguards our fundamental and unalienable rights. And one of the things is that in this society, and it's always been part of the American psyche, that if we were going to deprive anybody of their fundamental and unalienable rights, it needs to be done with due process under the law and equal application, or equal protection under the law. And we see that with the Fifth Amendment and, again, with the 14th Amendment. That is very, very important. And it just goes to show that when you have reporters who don't have to meet the same evidentiary status as anyone who goes before a court of law, running out and doing this type of editorialization and poisoning the prospective jury pool, that just gives the defense a technicality to wiggle out of it, and it means that the prosecution is hampered as well. But in respect to this case, the prosecution or the district attorney is a bit of a concern for me. And the reason that I say this is you go back to October of this year, and the particular victim, or alleged victim in this case, Andrea Constand, was involved with a defamation lawsuit of her own against the former district attorney who was defeated by Mr. Steele here, and I'm looking for his first name again, but anyway, this was Castor Jr. Castor Jr. was the name of the former district attorney, who was a Republican, who back in 2005 had basically said that there wasn't enough credible evidence to prove probable cause. And folks, when you look at the model rules of professional conduct, you'll see that it requires a prosecutor, and I believe it's Rule 3.8, it says that a prosecutor has a special duty to only bring charges if there is a strong indica that probable cause is there, that the accused will be found by a jury of his or her peers guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I know that that sounds like fancy lawyer talk, beyond a reasonable doubt. What does that even mean? Well, it's actually the highest evidentiary standard available in a court at law. So, just as a point of illustration here, in most civil suits, the level of proof, the evidentiary standard, is a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not, 51%. Well, beyond a reasonable doubt is 99.9%. That is a very difficult threshold to reach, and it does place a huge hurdle for the prosecutors to actually prosecute a case. And then when you look at the model rules of professional conduct, and each state has their own adoption of the model rules, and these are put out by the ABA, and that's a whole nother story, because I really don't have any love for the ABA, despite being a licensed attorney. But it goes to show that there is this higher standard, higher threshold that prosecutors are held to. And so Constant was suing Castor, the former Republican district attorney, for things that he had said about an advertisement that was used by Steele, who is a Republican turned Democrat, who basically put forth this advertisement using Constant as an attack against Castor. And then Castor came out and said, look, they're doing this as a political hack job. They're doing this to attack my character, to impugn my character, and basically using Constant as political, collateral damage. Well, Constant, who's now living in Canada, took exception to that and brought suit against him for saying that. But the problem is, with defamation, the truth is an absolute defense. And when you look at the fact that Steele was using this advertisement and using a case to attack his rival in the election, his opponent in the election, there are some serious ethical questions there too, because once again, Rule 3.8 speaks to a prosecutor not giving extrajudicial statements about a case that could heighten public condemnation of the accused. Well, that's exactly what we see happening, particularly with these news articles that follow the incident, and that can be found in an October 27th edition of People magazine, where they talked with Constant's lawyers about the defamation suit that has been filed against Castor. And here's the interesting thing. Andrea Constant, the self-admitted lesbian, former women's basketball coach at Temple University there in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, didn't say word one about Steele in his using her case as a political springboard to propel himself into the district attorney's office. And that is a major problem. It raises questions. Why? Why was she so selective? Now, her own attorneys had said that basically what Castor had said when he claimed that those who filed frivolous suits like that should be afraid because it's detrimental to our objective system. It's basically frivolous in a way, that he was saying that they should be afraid. Well, they were trying to say that that meant that she couldn't trust the district attorney, and therefore it was good that he was defeated on November 3rd. Irrespective of whether what Cosby did was right or wrong, it's now given him an outlet to really attack any prospective prosecution that's going to be brought against him. And because if you stop and think about it, the way that our legal system works is it's got to be a fair trial. Open, honest, fair, and swift trial. You know, we're talking about the Fifth and Sixth Amendments here. And so it goes to show that maybe she was just disappointed in Castor for saying back in 2005 that there wasn't enough substantial and credible evidence to prove probable cause. The way I see it, Castor was just trying to adhere to the code of ethics that attorneys are supposed to follow. And so what Steele is doing here is basically proving once again the negative stereotypes that are against lawyers. And, you know, a lot of stereotypes, almost every stereotype at least has a basis in truth. There is a modicum of truth behind stereotypes. And I hate to say that, but it's true. And this is just part of the war that Jeremy and I have declared on this cancerous doctrine of political correctness, because it literally is hampering our constitutionally endowed representative Republican system of government. And so we see that once again, this is going down political lines. So what? Are they trying to say that this is part of the Republican war on women? Absolutely. Absolutely, that's what they're going to try and do. And mark my words, this will probably become political fodder for the presidential campaign in 2016. But let's not forget that people on the left, people like Vermont Senator Burn Me Nerdface Sanders, are not without sin in this case. And that reminds me of something that he said back in the 1970s, and I'm actually going to pull up the quote here so that I make sure that I have it down right for you folks. Yeah, here it is. Back in February of 1972 to the Vermont Freeman newspaper, Bernie Sanders said, "A woman enjoys intercourse with her man as she fantasizes being raped by 3 men simultaneously." Now, how is that not considered a war on women? Why is that not given greater scrutiny by the salivating mainstream media? Well, the answer is the mainstream media is always going to adhere to this radical and extremist left-wing ideology and agenda that they adhere to. They are incapable of divorcing themselves from it, and they are just going to double down on this radical and twisted agenda at every given and available opportunity. But back to Cosby. Yes, we know that Cosby had admitted to doing dastardly things in the past, but in this particular case, I've just got to say, it seems that it's kind of fishy that, first of all, it's being brought just a few weeks before the statute of limitations is set to expire, that it's being brought by a district attorney who was basically the chief assistant district attorney at the time that this case was first brought, and thought nothing of the case at the time to say anything against the district attorney, because this is what true prosecutorial discretion is. And that's the thing, folks. The way that the Obama regime has been talking about prosecutorial discretion, especially with respect to the illegal alien issue that's been plaguing this country over the last several decades, but it's really gotten worse under this regime. They're saying prosecutorial discretion just means what laws they can apply. No, prosecutorial discretion goes to that ethical rule that I mentioned, the Model Rules of Professional Conduct Rule 3.8, which states that a prosecutor is held to a much higher standard than other officers of the court, meaning attorneys, with respect to only bringing criminal charges when there is a substantiated, reasonable belief that the case has merit and reaches the level of probable cause to find the accused guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And therefore, that means they have discretion when to file charges, but not discretion when or when not to use a law, or which law to use or not use. So you see, that's the type of dangerous game of semantics that we always see play out with the radical and extreme fringes of the left. They always try to obfuscate the truth, to bend it to their will, to their agenda. And it's essentially propaganda, going back to Joseph Goebbels' tenets on propaganda. If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth, but it has to be in a way that you don't lose the public and that it can't just come back to hurt you, that boomerang effect. Well, that's the problem with the utopian socialists in this country. Their little schemes here are not boomerang-proof. And, folks, what we're trying to do here at the Wright Flyer is just provide you with the truth. Now, again, don't just take what I'm saying at face value. Look it up for yourself. There is a lot of information, a plethora of information out there to corroborate what I'm saying. I'm just hoping to put you on the right path, to empower you with the knowledge so that you can foster this fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. And again, this is why I say, isn't it refreshing to have someone say, you know, you're not an idiot. You're not stupid. You're able to corroborate information on your own, to check up on it yourself, and to be powerful yourself. That is a true message of liberation. That is so much better than what the political powers that be are saying, or what the elitists who look down their noses at the ultimate wielders of sovereignty of this country, we the people, are saying. I want you to be empowered. I want you to know the truth. I want you to be able to take the steps to better your life. Because in so doing, we better the country and better each and every one of us. And is that not the goal that all Americans should have? You see, that's part of the problem here, folks. We've seen so much balkanization here in the United States that we no longer know what the common good is anymore. Our national identity, heritage, character has all come under attack. And we saw this in the immediate aftermath of those dastardly shootings at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church there in Charleston, South Carolina back in June, when the doctrine of political correctness led to a feeding frenzy against the Southern Cross battle flag. And we see the dangers of technology. You know, technology is such an anathema because it is a double-edged sword. It makes life so convenient. It makes it possible for me to produce a show like we do here with the Wright Flyer at Radio Aviation Excellence, but at the same time, it allows for certain groups, certain powerful companies to control the flow of information, and not just the flow of information, but the type of products you can buy. And it started with Walmart pulling the flag from their shelves, and then it went to Amazon.com pulling it from their shelves, and then Google blocked it in shopping. And that really does have a significant societal impact. And it's a type of social engineering that I don't think that companies should be engaged in. Because if you go back to what a corporation is supposed to do, based on its charter documents, it's supposed to make revenue for its shareholders. And it's supposed to fulfill that duty and obligation, not engage in social engineering. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we see happening in modern America, and technology has only heightened that, as we are just constantly connected to telecommunication devices. I mean, you know, you go back to the 1990s, and people were very, very concerned about this internet addiction or computer addiction. That was the story that was everywhere, particularly with the young adolescents at that time. And now, when you look at it, everybody's connected to the internet all the time because it's right there in your hip pocket or your shirt pocket or in your holster for your smartphone. And that's the other thing. These smartphones, they're just incredible because they have more power than a computer did even 5, 8 years ago. That is stupendous. That is amazing. But it also means that we're constantly hounded by information, this constant connection to the, and I know this is an outdated term, it's going to date me here, but the information superhighway. You know, that's how we used to look at the internet, but it is now being wielded as a weapon, and it is having serious, deleterious impacts on our legal system, on our culture, on our perceptions of the world, even right down to our etiquette. Because, you know, one of the things they talk about is this up-and-coming generation is just not able to speak to each other. They always go through text messaging. They don't look you in the eye. They don't have any of the old decorum that was expected of American generations of the past. And I think that I'm right at the cusp with this generation, because I am, having been born 30 years ago, I am part of the so-called Millennial Generation. But I grew up in a time when analog was king. I remember a time before the internet and before computers, and I remember the transition, and that the change was near instantaneous, and it's only accelerated as technological advances just jump ahead by leaps and bounds. We see that the older type of generation, the older way of looking at things, the older philosophy has just kind of gone away by the wayside. And so there is a drastic difference between somebody who was born in, say, 1975 or before, and somebody who was born in 1990 and after. And so I'm sure to a lot of those generations, when looking at this Bill Cosby story, they're like, who's this old man? Because Bill is 78 years old now. And it's just shocking to see how much things have changed. But with respect to his reputation, yes, he admitted to using these types of sedatives, which are now, you know, expressly prohibited by law, to get his way with women. But he said it was like offering somebody a drink. Now, that's sketchy. I'm sorry, but that one's a little difficult for me to buy, and it should be difficult for anybody to buy. But again, until the fact finder, the jury, or if he waives a jury, then the judge, makes an ultimate decision as to guilt or innocence, I'm not going to weigh in on it. Because, first of all, I'm not a party to the case. I'm not counsel in the case, and I'm not a judge or any part with that case. And so that's the thing that a lot of people get a disconnect with the legal system, the way it works, the formalities of it. And again, this speaks to the type of double-edged sword that technology is. Our legal system, in order to protect our fundamental and unalienable rights, it moves at a very antiquated pace. I mean, we're talking a system that is just now getting to using faxes and emails, e-discovery they call it now, to where we as criminal defense attorneys can sit there and make a discovery request with the prosecutor and have the information provided to us. You know, up until recently, there was no obligation on the part of the state, meaning the prosecutor or the government, to provide defense attorneys with the evidence that they plan to use at trial. And again, that kind of speaks to this whole idea of why they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Because in the past, and still to this day, the cards were sort of stacked against the defense. The defense doesn't have the type of near limitless resources that are at the disposal of the state. And so I always have to chuckle a little bit whenever I hear the district attorneys come out and whine about, well, you know, it's just not fair that we have to hold it to this standard. It's not fair that we have to adhere to the Fourth Amendment or get warrants. Why? Why? You have near limitless resources. You shouldn't complain about that. And, you know, folks, it goes to this whole idea about the indictment process with the grand jury. You know, the old adage that sticks with lawyers, particularly with criminal prosecutors, with the grand jury is that you could indict a ham sandwich. Why? Well, it's because there is no right to face your accuser in front of a grand jury. There is no right to counsel in front of a grand jury. There's no right to due process with it, because you don't have to be notified. You, the accused, do not have to be notified that your name's even being brought up for an indictment. And the prosecutor can use evidence that wouldn't pass evidentiary muster in a regular court case or trial. And so it is a very lopsided presentation. It's a very lopsided proceeding, and it's very much so stacked in the favor of the prosecutor. So already, when the defense counsel is heading into one of these cases, he or she is heading into it with their hands tied behind their back. And it is very difficult to actually win a case. In fact, most of your cases are going to be pleaded out, because there's going to be some sort of plea bargain, because there really is a lot of risk with moving forward with trial. Now, of course, that decision should ultimately and always fall to the client or the accused, because it is, after all, their fundamental and unalienable rights that are on the line there, and it is their choice, as it should be. But there are times when you look at what prosecutors do, when you have to wonder, are they really doing this out of an interest of justice, or are they doing this for political gain? Because these district attorneys are elected to their office. They are truly, truly politicians when you ultimately think about it. And that's why I have to give pause and question what it is exactly that Steele is trying to do by using Constance's case in deliberate, open violation of the model rules of professional conduct to attack Castor, the former district attorney, in order to take that office. And then we're talking just a little over a month after assuming office there, he jumps on a case that 10 years ago the prosecutor denied to go forward with, or refused to go forward with, because the evidence just wasn't there. Now, has there been a change? Yes, maybe, in some of these civil cases, but any defense attorney worth their salt is going to argue that issue preclusion kind of ties this out, that those cases have been decided and really shouldn't be used as evidence in this type of case, because then any type of case could be used against somebody. And it basically goes against this whole idea of self-incrimination. Because if that's past testimony, and especially when Cosby is available to be put on the stand, now, of course, it's the defense right to refuse to place him on the stand, then that's not the best evidence. That's not the evidence that should be used. Plus, he can invoke his Fifth Amendment right, and that is a deliberate violation of it as well. So we see that the prosecutor in this case is just basically going on kind of a witch hunt here without the evidence there to help them out. And Kevin Steele, is the current district attorney for Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And he's now bringing this case just mere weeks before the statute of limitations is set to toll or to run out on it, has used this advertisement to basically sweep aside his opponent, switched political parties in order to get this office, and has basically been accused by his former boss and now ousted district attorney Castor of using a case for political gain. And again, it raises questions for me as to why the accuser here, this Andrea Constant, is only going after the former district attorney. Well, it just is fascinating to see that. And then the way that the media goes off with this editorialization, it's just the recipe for a perfect storm in how not to do a criminal case. I mean, this should be used in criminal procedure law school courses as, hey guys, this is not how you do a case. If you want to screw things up, if you want to ensure that you're not living up to the standards of our criminal justice system, if you want to ensure that the faith of the people in the entire judiciary just crumbles even more, then you do it like this. But you really shouldn't, because it's against the rules of ethics. You really shouldn't, because it's against the fundamental and unalienable rights and the constitutional obligations of the citizens and the district attorneys. And see, that's the other thing. When we've developed a certain type of thought crime, think hate crimes here, these enhanced punishments for a certain type of thought pattern or belief that the accused had at a time, all of a sudden we see that this whole notion of equal protection under the law, equal applicability of the law, just kind of disintegrates. It means that now they are unraveling the system, that they are making the system unfair. And another area where this comes up, and it's quite controversial, is the rape shield laws. The way that the media is not allowed to usually provide the name of the accuser, but the name of the accused is allowed to go unfettered into the public, and they can be dragged through the dirt. And, a perfect example of where this is wrong and the type of damage that it has caused is look back to the Duke Lacrosse case. Here we have a similar type of case. We have a Democrat district attorney that was trying to make political points, Mike Nifong. He was bringing a case where the evidence was shoddy at best, and it ruined the reputations of those Duke Lacrosse players. Because, it ruined it for the team when the school suspended lacrosse at that time and for the next year. It ruined the reputations of the boys because they're always going to be seen as rapists, whether it's true or not. In fact, it wound up not being true. And that's something you just don't overcome. The tarnishment to your reputation, to your good name, is not something you overcome. And attorneys in particular ought to be very sensitive to this, because another adage goes that the only thing that we have as attorneys are our reputations. And if you shoot that, then what good are you? Because your reputation is shot. And that's really what happened with Mike Nifong. He got disbarred, and he spent a day in jail for engaging in this political witch hunt. He was using it to try and appeal to the very left-wing voting base of Durham, North Carolina. And it makes me wonder whether what we're seeing with Kevin Steele here in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, is kind of similar. I wonder if the same type of fate is awaiting him. Now, again, I'm not doing this to besmirch the prosecutor. I'm just doing this from having examined what little evidence I've had and making an educated guess. Of course, this is all idle speculation, wouldn't work in court, but I mean, the facts are there. He used this advertisement to attack his former boss and then political opponent, and won off of that. It heightens public condemnation of Bill Cosby, and let's face it, folks, yes, the things that he admitted to means that he's not the type of upstanding citizen that he tried to portray in his image back when he was this pop culture icon, this television sitcom icon, superstar. this image of being America's dad, no, that's destroyed. That's gone forever. And he can't recover that. But just because you're a creep, or just because you did something, if the evidence is not there to solidly prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, that he's guilty of something, or that there weren't mitigating circumstances or factors involved with it, that doesn't mean that you could just railroad him with criminal charges. We're talking prison time here. And one of the fundamental and unalienable rights of the people is the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, which has also been extrapolated to mean property. All of this is put at risk. And then your good name and character is certainly put up at risk as well. And now, granted, he certainly hasn't done himself any favors admitting to, well, it was just like giving somebody a drink. No, Billy, that's not how consent works. But what I'm seeing here is the groundwork for a type of political witch hunt that, if the facts are as they are, and if there aren't any other corroborating facts, and if the only evidence that the prosecutor has is this civil suit that has been opened by request by the media from earlier this year, then the idea that you could prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm not sure of that. I'm really not sure of that. And then there's things about the case, too, that just don't make sense. Why is it that this admitted lesbian, because one of the things that Andrea Constance said is she was certainly trying to avoid any type of sexual contact or intercourse with Cosby because at the time she was in a relationship with a woman. Okay. But so why only go after the Republican? Is this because it's trying to fit into the bigger image or this bigger message of the utopian socialists that have taken over the Democrat Party to say that the Republican Party is having a war on women? Look at that mean, nasty Castor who refused to take this case when clearly months later or years later, in fact years later, these civil suits would be brought, and then he admits to certain activities in those civil cases. Well, again, because the evidentiary standard is different, much lower of a threshold in a civil case, it means that the criminal case can't just rely on that kind of evidence. Because odds are, let's throw in this idea of, well, he's used quaaludes in the past to drug women and to have his way with them, then therefore that's proof that he's done this. That's impermissible character evidence. You see, folks, there are standards of evidence that apply to these criminal cases, and they are, to a much higher standard, and it should be to a much higher standard when we are talking about stripping somebody of their liberty, confining them with imprisonment, fining them with, and I believe it's up to $25,000 fine with this kind of case, and a decade at least in prison. That's a major deprivation of liberty, and we need to make sure that this is done in a prudent fashion, that the prosecutor's not cutting corners, that the prosecutor's not encroaching upon the constitutional rights of the accused. That is why our system operates with a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. That's what separates us from a lot of the European court systems. In the civil court systems, like the Napoleonic Code, which is still enforced in France, there was no presumption of innocence. You were presumed guilty until proven innocent. And could you imagine what a terrible system that would be? Especially when you consider the way that some of these district attorneys just engage in political shenanigans to attack and besmirch someone when there is no evidence of it. And that is a major problem in my home state of Texas. We see it with Tom DeLay, when they brought charges against him that just turned out to be unfounded accusations, and all of a sudden the case, was dropped. But meanwhile, his entire career, his entire reputation's been ruined, and now, yes, that district attorney's in jail. They used it against K. Bailey Hutchison, who, really wasn't that great of a senator, but the fact that they brought up charges and that it took time away from it, it just was disastrous. And then most recently, and the one that's still ongoing, is with former Texas Governor Rick Perry. Now, I'm not a big Rick Perry fan, but the fact that he was trying to get a district attorney who is supposed to prosecute those who are driving while intoxicated, DWI, was out doing that, got arrested, but then refused to step down from her post. No, I don't think that was an abuse of power by the governor. She should have stepped down. That would have been the ethical thing to do. But she, being a Democrat, and of the utopian socialist wing thereof, she has no ethics. She has no moral compass. She wasn't about to back down. But when you see that the criminal system can be used that way, if we had this type of civil system, and what I mean by that is it's based off of just the statutory code. There is no court interpretation of it. In fact, the courts cannot overturn parts of statutes or statutes at all, just with the parties that are involved. And then there's this presumption of guilt until you've proven your innocence. It means that it'd be much more difficult, especially when the prosecution is stacked against you and is acting in an unethical fashion to begin with. That highlights the type of dangers that our founding fathers were trying to avoid with the way in which they envision our criminal justice system, and not just our criminal justice system, our entire judiciary. Now, has it been perverted away from the Constitution? Yes, from the very beginning. Go back to the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison, and you see the court giving itself the power of judicial review, which is not found anywhere within the four corners of our Constitution. And it's a problem with a quote-unquote common law system like what we have here in the United States, that when precedent has been handed down and accepted for so long, it's as though it becomes a second strain of law. That's where the quote-unquote common law system has its weakness. Because when you stop and think about it, so-called judge-made law, you really can't have judge-made law. Because when you look at Article 3 of the United States Constitution, which sets up the judicial branch or judiciary, that power is not enumerated to them. And the way that our system, our representative Republican system of government, which is constitutionally endowed, is supposed to work, is that it's supposed to trace a power that is expressly enumerated to that particular branch of government via the Constitution itself. And that's another reason why Jeremy and I always say that it's a bad thing when you have Supreme Court justices saying, let's go look at foreign law. No. You are duty-bound to look at the Constitution. The Constitution, as per Article 6, Clause 2, is the supreme law of the land. It is binding above all others. It is the ultimate source of authority and law in this country. Therefore, any and all foreign law would be inapplicable, because it is contrary to the clear and concise language contained within the Constitution. And that's the sort of disconnect that we see with the utopian socialists that just want to run ramshod over those they disagree with. And that's also this dangerous characteristic that we see with the up-and-coming generation with respect to our freedom of expression, our First Amendment rights. They are wanting to limit it. especially when it's in this crusade for social justice warriors pushing for this cancerous doctrine of political correctness. Again, that's why we have declared war on political correctness. You know, we have all of these so-called societal wars or social wars. We have the war on poverty. We have the war on drugs. We have the war on, now, women, or the so-called war on women. No, those things are not effective. They're not working, and in the case of the alleged war on women, they're not even true. We have political correctness being utilized as a weapon to tear apart our shared Constitution. And it's important to remember that the greatest birthright or inheritance of any people on earth is the United States Constitution. It was such a well-thought-out document that it is the longest contiguous, meaning uninterrupted, constitution or governmental document or law in the world. It is absolutely the longest applicably contiguous constitutional document in the modern world. And that just goes to show that it was beautifully thought out, that it is a great force of stabilization. It is a great natural law principle. And again, it also demonstrates why, when these hecklers from the radical and extreme fringes of the left try and come out and say, well, it's an outdated document. Well, that's wrong too. Because the natural law tenets that underpin our shared United States Constitution are by their very nature timeless. That means they can't be antiquated. That means they can't be outdated. And that only someone who has a radical agenda would embrace such a message. That there is an ulterior motive there. And there absolutely is. Remember, when Barack Hussein Obama was going to run for office the first time, right when he was coming up to clinching the presidency, he said, what was it, in a matter of hours we will fundamentally transform the United States, or we're just a few hours from fundamentally transforming the United States? Why does it need to be fundamentally transformed? We don't need to fundamentally transform the nation, because if you fundamentally transform it, you are depriving the true ultimate wielders of sovereignty, we the people, of their rightful authority. It means that you're trying to create a despotic, tyrannical, centralized system that has no place in an open, free society, as our founding fathers envisioned this country to be over 2 centuries ago. Instead, we should be embracing what is good about America. And that is our Constitution. But you saw it when he went on his apology tour, that first time around, bowing to the King of Saudi Arabia, apologizing for America being America, and for Americans being endowed by their Creator with certain fundamental and unalienable rights. Why look at that as something to be ashamed of? You see, there is a full frontal assault on everything that is good and decent about America and her citizens. There is this desire to tear us down in some crazy redistributive scheme. And that's always what it comes down to with these radical and extremist utopian socialists. It's always a redistributive scheme designed to punish those who have been willing to take a risk to have success. You know, it goes back to a teacher that I had, a professor I had in college, who sat there and said, gee, it's really unfair that those who have amassed wealth are able to pass it down on their children. We shouldn't have inheritance. Why? Is that not the earnings and the benefits of those who have gone out through their own entrepreneurial endeavors, through their own creativity, or through their own frugalness, to pass down as they see fit? You see, that's the whole notion. These radical, extremist left-wingers absolutely loathe and despise the idea of having private property. That to them is an anathema. That to them is some deleterious thing that should be pushed off the face of the map. Well, folks, that type of thinking, that kind of mindset is diametrically opposed to everything that is great about the United States Constitution, and that is the danger that we're facing with these type of people. And it's taking root with this so-called million student march that we've been seeing, the so-called political activism at the University of Missouri, where their former president, who I'm sure espoused all of these stupid utopian socialist agendas and views, was forced to step down. Why? Well, he committed the most terrible crime with the lefts. He was born without any pigmentation in his skin, so he was white. And he was born with a certain type of genitalia, meaning he was male. Oh, dear. And then maybe he was also heterosexual, and if that's the case, really, we have to go out against him. We have to strike out against him, because he is clearly this paragon of white privilege. What a load of malarkey. It absolutely is a load of malarkey. And it has no place in a free and open society like the United States of America. But you're not going to hear that from the salivating mainstream media. No, you're going to see them go after those who have spoken the truth. You know, if Bill Cosby had accepted the point of view like that espoused by Barack Hussein Obama, or the former Attorney General Eric Holder, or the current Attorney General Loretta Lynch, they'd be sitting there saying, look, we have a white district attorney bringing criminal charges against a poor black man, and all of a sudden, it would be, look, this is just more proof of white privilege attacking the underprivileged minority. Why? Why does it always have to be that same tired message? And why is it selectively applied? These are the types of questions that the mainstream media, as the watchdogs for the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in this country, we the people should be asking. Yet they are totally derelict in their duty. They outright refuse to do their job. They're not being duly diligent here because they are towing the line of a radical and twisted agenda, an agenda that ties into them and, pushes forward this utopian socialist goal. And that's why you see this type of editorialization, like, the evidence is strong, said Montgomery County Prosecutor Kevin Steele, announcing a single count of aggravated indecent assault against the creepy comedian. What value does that add to the story? What purpose does that gain? What truth does that reveal? Okay, so the guy's a creep. So what? How is that relevant? You see, that's the thing. They throw in these little propagandistic twists, these little games of semantics that are wholly irrelevant to the purpose of the story in order to paint somebody in a bad light. And of course, another example of where we saw this kind of thing was with the George Zimmerman case. Zimmerman may not be the best individual that's ever been around. In fact, he's probably a bit of a nitwit. But this idea of where they always tried to say, and this was cute too, white Hispanic, who was a wannabe cop, that was another one that they threw out, attacked this unarmed black teenage angel paragon of virtue when they mentioned Trayvon Martin. But Trayvon Martin had an extensive criminal history. Trayvon Martin was out in the dead of night, peeking into the windows of homes. He had, at his school at least, the day before, a burglary tool set that's used to burglarize homes, and there had been a string of prior break-ins in that neighborhood. So, why would it be that, he was just unarmed, and he was, he just had his Skittles? And then the way that they would superimpose his childlike photograph that was years old against the mugshot of Zimmerman, that is the type of unscrupulous yellow journalism, sensationalist journalism, if you can even call it journalism, that is just running rampant through the salivating mainstream media. And it's unfair. And not only is it what I would call unfair, it's unethical. But ethics doesn't matter to these people. They throw in those little irrelevant factoids to push their agenda. And then, there were even accusations that I can't remember whether it was CBS or NBC, but one of those had basically tried to lighten the pigmentation or skin color of George Zimmerman to once again heighten this type of racial war story that they want to push forward, this agenda that, oh, look, race is just, we haven't solved anything, and just yesterday there were slaves in America. But then, what was it? Just 2 or 3 days ago, we learned that ISIS had put out a new rule book on how to treat their slaves? Oh. Well, it's not all Islamists, and okay, so some Islamic countries have slavery, but, that's just because they're misunderstood. We don't understand them, and that they have been forced that way. Climate change, look, squirrel, over there, run for it. Really? We're gonna have somebody like Nerdface Bernie Sanders sit there and say that climate change caused this. But we gotta pull down the Confederate flag, folks, because, that had to do with slavery. Oh, but we're not going to mention the fact that these people that have declared outright war on the United States, these Islamo-fascists, still hold slaves to this very day. We're not going to mention that African countries still hold slaves today. We're not going to mention that it was African tribes that sold people into slavery. We're not even going to mention that the first owner of slaves in colonial America, before we even became the United States of America, was a black man in Maryland. Why don't we mention that? Because it doesn't fit the politically correct narrative, this weapon that they're trying to use to thrust cultural Marxism down our throats, to destroy our shared heritage and our national identity. That is the nefarious truth. That is their dark agenda. That is what they are trying to thrust upon us, and we have to put our foot down and say, no, enough is enough. We're not going to allow you to use raw emotionalism, these so-called empirical evidence stories of, I know that Johnny was a poor gay black kid who was just abused because of his skin color, and therefore he was considered a terrorist just because of his skin color. No, we're not going to allow that to continue, because that has nothing to do with what you're trying to push forward. Because what you then do is use those little sob stories that may or may not be real, that may or may not have happened, to deprive the ultimate wielders of sovereignty of this country of their fundamental and unalienable rights. What you're doing is an ulterior motive. And it goes down this line of the type of semantics you've played with terms like progressive. Oh, well, that sounds good. Progressive, yeah. Who could be against progress? Well, do you know where progress can be viewed as a bad thing? What about the progressive steps of cancer? Oh, the cancer has progressed from your liver to your bones. It's progressed to your lymph node system. You're going to die. But it's progress. It must be good. Well, that's exactly what the progressive movement is. It's a cancer. And it's metastasized. And if we don't act with extreme measures like chemotherapy to eradicate it, to remove it from a true, open, and free society, we will commit national suicide. And that's their goal. Their goal is to destroy what came before, so then they can build up this new world image for themselves, this new utopian socialist paradise where we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Except it doesn't work that way. What they're really doing is building a new feudalist system. That's why I call them neo-feudalists. They want to be overlords over the American people. They want to flaunt their power, create a separate power or legal system that applies to them, but then force their draconian, overzealous regulations on us so that we are essentially New Age serfs. That we have to do as they say, not as they do, pay up to them while they live these wasteful and lavish lifestyles. You know, that's why I found the whole Occupy Wall Street movement so laughable. The 1% that they're whining about are the ones that they're turning to for solutions. The political class is the true dictators of what is or is not capable of wealth. And stop and think about that, folks. Remember, we sent Martha Stewart to jail for illicit insider trading. But that doesn't apply to congressmen. They're allowed to do insider trading. Any governmental actor, except for maybe some of the nameless, faceless, and ultimately unaccountable bureaucrats, don't have to follow the same law, don't have to follow the same rule. And even if they did, they'd find some way out of it. Look at the case of Charlie Rangel and his tax evasion. You know, if he had been an average, ordinary citizen, he would have been just railroaded, sent to jail. We can't cheat on our taxes, but maybe if we're very, very close to the president, like Timmy Geithner, well, then you can get away with it. Or if you work for the president, you can, violate any law you want to. Lois Lerner comes to mind. Hey, maybe if you're also part of the president's party, you can not only sit there and try and deprive the American citizens, the ultimate wielders of sovereignty, of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms, but hey, you can have all of these corruption allegations and charges that were there, and, your brother's been charged with a courthouse corruption scheme, and, it was alleged that you were engaged in payouts or tax deals or tax favors to your campaign contributors. That's right, David Cicilline, I'm talking about you Rhode Island scum. Well, you can go to Congress and just make even more money for yourself. Hey, I'm seeing a pattern here, an undeniable pattern of a separate type of legal system. Hey, here's another one. Maybe you could break the law, and because you don't want anybody to have access through Freedom of Information Act claims or whatever else to the files and information that you used while holding a government office, I'm thinking Secretary of State here, on a private server. That way you can scrub it, and even when you obstruct justice, nothing will happen to you. Hey, that's Hillary Clinton. Or maybe you can sit there and hack into your political opponent, even though it's on the same party. Yes, it's frowned upon, but gain information that you weren't supposed to have access to, and then just say, oops, I'm sorry. Well, I'm running as a Democrat. I was once an independent. It's Bernie Sanders, and I'm going to say, after I'm done hitting the sauce, I'm really sorry about getting all of that email stuff that I wasn't supposed to. Maybe if you didn't keep it on private server. But I said we wouldn't talk about private servers because, it's a war on women, squirrel over there. Look, ADD kicking in right now. You see, once again, a separate standard of rules applies to them than to the rest of us. That is the duplicitous nature with respect to these utopian socialists that is damning to this country. And we see it playing out in this Bill Cosby story. And it's just par for the course with these utopian socialists that are hell-bent on depriving us of our liberty. Yet, because we know that we are endowed by our Creator with certain fundamental and unalienable rights which no rightful or legitimate earthly authority can take away without due process. We know what is right, and we know what the truth is. And of course, that's what we are always aiming for here at the Wright Flyer. And with that said, it is now time to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm your Captain Randy Wright, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. And I invite you to leave comments, concerns, questions, what have you, either here on our YouTube page, our Google Plus page, or our Facebook page, and hope that you join Jeremy and me the next time we take off over the friendly airwaves, providing you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment as we always do here on the Wright Flyer. Thank you for flying with us, folks. See you again next time. Do take care.